In 1997, Mike Markham, a self-taught electrical tinkerer, spent years building a massive, highly experimental machine inside his garage. He connected high-voltage transformers, coils of copper wire, and a complex network of circuits, an invention designed to manipulate energy in ways no one had ever attempted before. Then, one night, he stepped inside and disappeared, completely. By morning, his garage had burned to the ground. Investigators found melted metal, scorched concrete, and a single surviving clue, a handwritten note that read, "It's not about time, it's about how you see things." The truth? Mike had just tested what many would call the world's first functioning time machine. For the next 29 years, the early internet and late-night paranormal radio audiences fiercely argued over exactly what had happened to Mike Markham. Was it a successful case of literal time travel? Was it a covert government abduction to silence a rogue inventor? Had he accidentally ripped open a portal to an entirely different dimension? Some skeptics aggressively argued that he was simply dead, consumed by the extreme heat of the electrical fire. Others claimed the entire story was a massive hoax and that Mike Markham never actually existed at all. And then, in the year 2022, the impossible happened. Mike Markham miraculously reappeared. He was older, profoundly exhausted, and carrying a heavy wooden box completely filled with handwritten journals, complex electrical diagrams, and 29 years of documented evidence. But what he brought back with him was not triumphant proof of a working time machine. It was something far, far worse. This is the complete, terrifying story of a man who accidentally broke reality, and the horrific price he had to pay for it. Mike Markham grew up in rural Missouri during the 1970s and 1980s. He was just an ordinary kid who harbored a deeply dangerous, all-consuming obsession with raw electricity. He spent his youth scavenging heavy, discarded transformers from local junkyards and passionately teaching himself advanced electronics by reading dusty textbooks from the local public library. He spent every single free hour he had locked inside a converted garage situated right behind his rented farmhouse. He dedicated his life to building things that threw massive sparks into the air, towering Tesla coils, buzzing Jacob's ladders, and absolutely anything that could produce a lethal, high-voltage arc of electricity. He didn't have a grand scientific plan or a specific goal in mind. He simply loved the raw, terrifying, untamed power of the electric current. In the early 1990s, Mike built a standard Jacob's ladder in his garage, a common device where an electrical arc climbs between two V-shaped metal rods. But late one night, he shined a cheap laser pointer directly through the crackling electricity. The arc instantly stabilized and became incredibly focused. But the impossible part was what happened next. When Mike tossed small metal objects like screws and coins into the stabilized field, they didn't fall. For a fraction of a second, they completely vanished from existence before popping right back into physical reality. This anomaly split Mike's life in half. Convinced he had defied the known laws of physics, he became utterly consumed, meticulously documenting every voltage level and wiring configuration. Desperate to know he wasn't losing his mind, he called the legendary late-night radio show Coast to Coast AM in January 1995. He nervously told host Art Bell that his device could make solid objects vanish. Skeptical, Art asked if the bright arc was simply creating an optical illusion. Mike's chilling response silenced the veteran host. "I know it disappears because I can physically feel it. When the field hits right, everything in the garage feels wrong. The air feels heavy. My dog absolutely refuses to come anywhere near the garage anymore. Birds won't land on the roof." After a long, heavy pause, Art gave Mike a public directive: document everything, get it on video, and call back. That single invitation escalated Mike's dangerous obsession. No longer satisfied with making small screws flicker, he wanted to massively amplify the field's power. His scavenged junkyard equipment wasn't enough. In the sweltering summer of 1995, Mike made a reckless, illegal leap. He broke into a rural electrical substation, physically stole 6 massive industrial transformers, and wired them together in his garage to pull a terrifying amount of raw electricity directly from the local power grid. When Mike finally threw the switch and fired up his new, amplified machine, the massive draw of power was so incredibly catastrophic that it instantly caused a massive brownout across several neighboring rural properties. Lights violently flickered and died, and expensive household equipment was completely fried. It didn't take long for the angry utility investigators to trace that massive, impossible surge of electricity straight back to the amateur wiring of Mike's garage. He was promptly arrested by the local police, officially charged with grand theft and reckless endangerment of the public, and sentenced to serve 60 agonizing days in the county jail. For most rational people, sitting in a cold jail cell would have been the ultimate wake-up call. It would have been the moment they stopped the madness, learned their lesson, and went back to quietly fixing broken appliances. But not Mike Markham. Those 60 days locked inside a small cell only made his dark obsession significantly worse. Cut off from his tools, he spent every single waking hour sitting on his cot, furiously sketching entirely new electrical diagrams, obsessively refining his complex mathematical calculations, and meticulously planning an even more powerful, efficient build for when he got out. He eventually walked out of those county jail doors, far more dangerously obsessed than when he had first walked in. When Mike was finally released in late 1995, he immediately kept his promise and called back into Coast to Coast AM. But the moment Mike started speaking, Art Bell noticed something incredibly different. Mike's voice had fundamentally changed. It was no longer the voice of a nervous, excited tinkerer. It was significantly darker, much more urgent, and bordered on pure desperation. Mike quickly told Art that he had completely rebuilt his entire system from scratch. This time, he claimed, he did it entirely legally, using properly purchased components. He had heavily refined the core design, implementing much better control mechanisms and a highly precise laser stabilization grid. And because of these massive upgrades, the physical effects of the machine were absolutely no longer subtle. "Objects aren't just flickering anymore, Art," Mike said, his voice tight with anxiety. "They're completely gone for full seconds, and when they finally come back, sometimes they come back wrong." Mike then detailed a series of deeply unsettling new experiments. He placed a solid wooden block into the crackling field. It vanished for 3 seconds and reappeared ice cold, as if it had been in a freezing environment. A fresh flower disappeared into the void and returned completely wilted and dead, as though days had rapidly passed. But the most terrifying confession was his test on a living creature. Mike placed a live mouse into the machine. It vanished for 5 terrifying seconds. When it finally reappeared, it was completely disoriented, moving erratically and refusing to eat. It died 2 days later. Art Bell's voice shifted to genuine dread as he pleaded with Mike to stop experimenting alone and bring in credentialed scientists, but Mike was completely past the point of listening to reason. In late February 1996, Mike made his final haunting broadcast. He shocked the veteran late-night audience by announcing he had successfully enlarged the physical size of the electromagnetic field. It was no longer just a small pocket of energy. It was now large enough that he could physically step into it himself. "It's like absolutely everything around you slows down, except for you," Mike explained over the static of the AM radio. He said he could literally see things happening in slow motion and actively move between the seconds. Upon stepping out, he would instantly realize far more time had passed in the real world than he had actually experienced. There was a moment of absolute dead silence on the line before Art finally asked the massive question. "Mike, are you telling me you've built a working time machine?" Mike paused for a long time, admitting he wasn't sure. He believed the field disrupted either normal human perception or normal reality itself. Plagued by deep paranoia over unmarked cars and intense government surveillance, Mike promised to call back in March with absolute proof. That promised call never came. By March 1997, Mike had gone terrifyingly silent, and his rural farmhouse sat abandoned. Then, the infamous night arrived. His garage violently burned down to its concrete foundation. Investigators sifting through the smoking wreckage found massive puddles of melted copper, completely destroyed transformers, and an impossible 6-foot circular burn pattern perfectly scorched into the floor. There was absolutely no body. There was only a metal toolbox containing a single cryptic note. "It's not about time. It's about how you see things." The local investigators officially concluded that Mike had probably fled the property long before the fire started. They suspected he might have even intentionally set the blaze himself to destroy his dangerous equipment. They filed the standard missing person report, quickly closed the official case file, and never seriously pursued it again. But on the rapidly growing internet of 1997, the story absolutely detonated. By that summer, Mike Markham had transformed into an untouchable internet legend. Early paranormal forums exploded with wild, passionate theories. Users argued that he had successfully time-traveled to the distant future, or perhaps thrown himself deep into the past. Others insisted he had opened a portal to another world, or that the government had assassinated him to steal his technology. Coast to Coast AM devoted entire multi-hour episodes exclusively to discussing the great mystery of his disappearance. As the legend grew, strange anomalies fueled the fire. In 1998, internet sleuths unearthed a 1930 news clipping about an unidentified body on a California beach. The man wore unusually modern clothing and carried a metallic device with LED-like indicators that perfectly matched Mike's design sketches. The internet quickly concluded Mike had accidentally traveled to 1930 and died there. The mystery sat dormant until September 2006 when Oregon physics professor Dr. Perst Harold Voss received a chilling email from Mike. "I know people think I'm dead. I'm not. But I'm not exactly here either. The machine worked, but absolutely not how I thought it would." Attached were highly advanced, third-generation circuit diagrams. Dr. Voss traced the email's IP address to a public library in Hawaii, but it was just another dead end. Then came the massive revelation in 2022, 29 years after Mike vanished. Andrew and Melanie Carter were renovating their old farmhouse in rural Ohio when they found a sealed wooden box hidden deep in the attic insulation. The label read, "M. Markham, do not open until the right time." Inside were journals spanning from 1995 to 2021, pristine circuit boards, and a Polaroid of an older Mike standing beside a large metal ring. The photo was dated June 21, 2021, with a handwritten note on the back. It did work, but not the way I thought it would. One of the journals contained the Carters' exact Ohio street address, identifying it as a safe storage location with optimal magnetic field stability. How could Mike have known this decades ago? The Carters posted their discovery on Reddit, and it went massively viral. 3 weeks later, Andrew received a phone call from an unmistakable, exhausted voice. "This is Mike Markham. Can I come visit?" Mike arrived in October 2022. He was 59 years old, but looked completely worn down by something unseen. Sitting in their living room, he completely shattered the time travel myth. "The machine didn't move me through time at all," Mike explained heavily. "It desynchronized me from everyone else. I was still here in the exact same moments but completely out of phase with reality, like a radio tuned slightly off frequency. You are physically present, but you are not quite there." He finally revealed the truth about the 1997 fire. He had stepped fully into his most powerful field yet. There was no flash of light, just a quiet feeling of deep disconnection, as if the world had shifted slightly to the left. When he stepped out, hours had passed in the blink of an eye, and the overheated machine was engulfed in flames. He escaped the fire, but when he tried to contact the people in his life, he realized something was fundamentally wrong with reality. Friends recognized his face but couldn't place his name. His landlord had only a vague memory of renting to him. Mike's very existence was being partially, systematically erased from human perception. "I didn't physically disappear," Mike told the Carters. "I just became incredibly hard to find and virtually impossible to remember. Like your brain couldn't quite hold on to the concept of me anymore. And the absolute worst part was, every single time I had tested the machine on myself over the years, the effect got worse. With every exposure, I became a little less real to everyone else." Over the decades that followed the fire, his tragic desynchronization only deepened. He tried to live a normal life, but jobs never lasted because his own co-workers would literally forget that he worked there. He couldn't even maintain a simple bank account because the bank clerks could never remember opening one for him. He was forced to become a complete drifter, surviving entirely on under-the-table cash jobs, sleeping in temporary rented rooms, constantly moving to places where absolutely nobody needed to remember his name. And all the while, in the shadows, he kept obsessively researching, desperately trying to understand exactly what he had done to his own body, and what terrifying truth he had actually discovered in that garage. He finally realized a horrific truth. The massive machine he built did not manipulate time. It actively manipulated human perception, biological memory, and the delicate quantum probability states that literally determine whether a physical person can be actively observed and remembered by the universe. Every single person only exists because other people actively remember them, Mike told the Carters, his eyes wide with sorrow. Memory is what physically creates reality, and I permanently damage my own biological ability to be remembered. You can clearly see me right now sitting on this couch. We are actively talking, but this connection is incredibly fragile, and it is actively getting worse by the day. Andrew and Melanie asked him the most obvious question. If you've been hiding for 29 years, why come back to us now? Mike sadly explained that his time was rapidly running out. Every single exposure to the machine's field had exponentially deepened the erasing effect. He confessed that he could now barely stay physically and mentally coherent to any human being for more than just a few short hours. Soon, he believed, he would become completely and totally unmemorable, physically present in the room, but entirely unperceivable by the human mind, cursed to exist forever purely in the dark spaces between people's attention. He revealed that he had carefully planned this specific moment many years ago. He had deliberately hidden the heavy wooden box in their attic because the local magnetic field stability was optimal for preserving physical evidence. He had patiently waited for the right people to buy the house and find it, people who would carefully document his entire life's work before he slipped completely and forever into the dark void of unmemory. Before he finally stood up to leave, Mike Markham asked the Carters for 3 very specific promises. First, he asked them to securely send all of his handwritten journals to a highly private research archive, entrusting them to careful people who would study his lifelong work without ever recklessly attempting to replicate the dangerous machine. Second, he told them to securely lock the attic door permanently, warning them that some of the old equipment left behind in the walls was still highly magnetically active and dangerous. And finally, he begged them to never, ever try to contact him again. The Carters, completely overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation, quietly agreed to his terms. Mike politely thanked them for their time, turned around, and slowly walked out their front door into the fading light of the afternoon. And this is the specific part of the story that will permanently stay with you, the true horror of unmemory. Andrew and Melanie both independently described experiencing the exact same terrifying phenomenon. The absolute second that Mike Markham stepped out of their house and the front door clicked shut, they realized they had to actively, painfully concentrate just to remember what his face looked like. The vivid image of his weathered features started rapidly dissolving in their minds almost immediately, slipping through their thoughts exactly like trying to hold rushing water in tightly clenched fists. Panic set in. Within mere minutes of his departure, Melanie frantically grabbed a notepad from the kitchen counter and started furiously writing down absolutely everything she could possibly remember about their conversation. Because the specific details were already violently slipping away into a dark mental fog, Andrew found himself standing frozen in the living room, staring blankly at the empty wall, desperately trying to recall the exact sound of Mike's tired voice, and realizing with pure horror that he completely couldn't. Within just one single hour, they were reading their own frantic, handwritten notes exactly like they were reading a complete stranger's handwriting. The ink on the paper was definitely theirs, but the actual living memory behind the written words was rapidly fading into total darkness. Within a week of the visit, the mental erasure was nearly complete. They literally had to sit down and read their own notes just to mentally reconstruct the fact that the conversation had ever happened at all. The raw human emotion of the visit, the profound awe they felt, the deep, creeping dread, the heavy, tragic weight of everything Mike had desperately confessed to them, was completely dissolving into something vague, distant, and utterly formless. They described it as being exactly like waking up from a deeply profound dream that you know in your soul was incredibly important, but that you absolutely cannot find the words to describe once your eyes are open. Now, years after that fateful afternoon, the Carters say the profound encounter simply feels like something that happened to an entirely different person, or perhaps a strange movie they only half remember watching late at night. They logically know that the visit was completely real because the heavy journals are sitting right there. The 2021 Polaroid photograph is physically real. Their own frantic, handwritten notes are sitting in a folder, but the actual living, breathing memory of sitting directly across from Mike Markham on their living room couch is almost entirely, permanently gone. That is exactly what true unmemory looks like. It is not simply forgetting where you put your keys. It is something much, much worse. It is the slow, quiet, unstoppable erasure of a human being's physical presence from your own mind. Even while the hard, physical evidence of their very existence is sitting right there in front of you on the coffee table. The Mike Markham case leaves us with a profound, lingering question that ultimately has absolutely nothing to do with building time machines in a garage. It is a question that is much simpler than that and infinitely more terrifying. What happens when the fundamental thing that makes you real to others, their ability to perceive and remember you, permanently breaks? Mike Markham's tragic life provides the horrifying answer. You don't die, and you don't physically disappear. You simply become impossible to hold on to. A blurry face no one can describe. A name that slips off the tongue. A physical presence that completely dissolves the moment you leave a room. The Carters kept their promise. The heavy journals were securely sent to a private archive, and the attic door was permanently locked. Since that day in 2022, there have only been faint, completely unverified sightings. An older man asking highly complex questions in university physics departments. A quiet attendee at a science conference who introduced himself as Mike Markham, but whose face no one could recall the next day. A brilliant drifter at a homeless shelter who never stays long enough for anyone to learn his real name. These are just the tiny traces, the fading echoes of a man actively slipping further into the dark void of unmemory. Somewhere out there right now, Mike Markham is still alive. He is still walking through a world that can barely perceive him, desperately trying to be remembered by someone before the very last thread of his existence completely snaps. He is terrified of the moment he finally falls through the quantum cracks of our reality, for good, alive, physically present, and completely, irreversibly forgotten by the universe. The machine he built in that Missouri garage absolutely worked. It just did not work the way anyone on Earth ever expected it to. The terrible price he paid for his discovery was a fate significantly worse than death. Mike Markham found a way to completely break reality, and in the end, reality broke him.